The day a man thinks he's taken everything from a woman is usually the day he loses everything he can never buy back. The ballroom shimmered in gold and crystal, a cathedral of power and wealth suspended 70 floors above Manhattan, where billionaires didn't just attend events. They owned them, controlled them, rewrote the rules beneath the chandeliers that reflected their influence in fractured light. And tonight every eye turned not toward the stage, not toward the investors being honored, but toward the woman who had just stepped through the doors as if she had always belonged there, as if the room itself had been waiting for her return. Amara Bennett moved with quiet precision, her black silk gown catching the light like a controlled flame, not loud, not desperate, but undeniable, the kind of presence that didn't ask for attention because it commanded it. And for a moment the orchestra seemed to fade, the conversations softened, and even the air shifted as though something unspoken had entered the space, something powerful enough to unsettle men who built empires for a living. Across the room, Richard Caldwell felt it before he saw her, that subtle disruption in control he had spent years perfecting, the kind that tightened his jaw just slightly, the kind that made his grip on the crystal glass a fraction firmer. And when he turned, when his eyes found her, time did something strange, something slow and deliberate, like a memory forcing its way back into the present whether it was welcome or not, because there she was, not the woman he had dismissed, not the woman he had erased from his life as if she had been nothing more than a temporary inconvenience, but something else entirely, something sharper, colder, refined by absence and silence. And for the first time in months, maybe longer, Richard Caldwell did not look like the most powerful man in the room. Whispers began before anyone consciously spoke them, subtle at first, like ripples beneath polished surfaces. "That's her," someone murmured near the champagne tower. "That's Amara Bennett," another voice added, softer, almost reverent, as if saying her name required a shift in tone. And the recognition spread not through noise but through awareness, the kind that travels faster than sound in rooms built on perception and hierarchy. Amara didn't rush, didn't hesitate, didn't acknowledge the weight of the room pressing toward her as she walked, because she had learned something in the months since everything had been taken from her. That silence, when chosen, was louder than any explanation, and dignity, when held, was stronger than any revenge. The stage lights caught the edge of her profile as she passed beneath them, illuminating not just her presence but her transformation, the invisible architecture of strength built piece by piece in places no one had bothered to look. And somewhere between the flash of cameras and the shifting attention of the city's most powerful figures, a truth settled quietly into the room like a verdict already decided. She had not returned to reclaim what was lost. She had returned because she had become something greater than what she had ever been allowed to be. Richard's chest tightened, not with panic, not yet, but with something far more dangerous, recognition. Because the woman standing across that room was no longer someone he could control, no longer someone whose worth could be defined by his approval. And in that moment, surrounded by wealth, influence, and everything he once believed made him untouchable, he understood something he had not anticipated, something no contract or strategy had prepared him for. The story he thought he had ended, had only just begun. The applause came a few seconds too late, as if the room needed time to remember how to respond to something it had not anticipated. And when it finally arrived it was polished, controlled, the kind of applause that belonged to people who never showed surprise, only approval. Yet beneath the surface there was something else moving, something unsettled, something that could not be rehearsed. Amara Bennett did not acknowledge it immediately, her gaze steady as she reached the stage, each step measured not in distance but in intention, because tonight was not about proving anything to them, it was about standing in a space that once would have rejected her and knowing she no longer needed its acceptance. The presenter extended a hand, his smile practiced, but his eyes lingered just a fraction longer than necessary, recognition flickering there, not from the headlines that now carried her name, but from the quiet understanding that power does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it walks in after everything else has been stripped away. Investor of the Year, he announced, his voice echoing through the ballroom, but the title felt almost secondary to the presence that held the room in place. And as Amara accepted the award, the glass surface catching the light like a mirror, she saw not just her reflection but the distance she had traveled to stand here without hesitation. Somewhere in the crowd, Richard remained still, his expression composed in the way only men like him could manage, but his mind refused to cooperate with the image he tried to maintain, because this was not the narrative he had written, not the outcome he had calculated when he signed the papers that severed her from everything they had built together. And yet here she was, not asking for anything, not demanding recognition, simply existing in a way that rewrote the entire equation. A journalist near the front raised her voice. polite but pointed. "Ms. Bennet, your rise has been described as unusually rapid. What would you say was the turning point?" And for a moment the room leaned in. Not because they needed the answer, but because they wanted to understand the part of the story they had not witnessed. Amara paused, not for effect, but because the truth did not require urgency, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the podium as she considered how much of it belonged to them, how much of it could be spoken without diminishing its meaning. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, steady, untouched by the weight of the past that had shaped it. "The turning point was the moment I stopped asking for permission to belong," and the words settled into the room with a quiet finality that did not need explanation. There were no details about loss, no mention of what had been taken, no reference to the man who had once stood at the center of her life. As if he had defined it, because the most powerful part of her story was not what had been done to her, it was what she had chosen to become afterward. Richard exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if releasing something he had not realized he was holding. But the tension did not leave him. It shifted, deepened, because now the distance between them was no longer measured in months or miles. It was measured in transformation, in the quiet realization that the woman he had dismissed had not disappeared. She had evolved beyond the version of her he thought he understood. As the applause rose again, more certain this time, Amara stepped back from the podium, her expression unchanged, her composure intact, and as she turned to leave the stage her eyes moved briefly across the crowd, not searching, not lingering, but for a fraction of a second they met his, and in that silent exchange there was no anger, no accusation, only something far more definitive, something that required no words at all, the understanding that whatever existed between them before no longer held any power now. The music resumed as if nothing had shifted, as if the balance of the room had not quietly tilted in a direction no one had predicted, but Richard Caldwell remained exactly where he stood, his glass untouched now, the amber liquid catching the light in a way that felt almost mocking, because for the first time in a long time he was no longer certain of the outcome of the night, and uncertainty was not something he allowed space for. Around him, conversations restarted in carefully measured tones, investors recalibrating their interest, executives adjusting their attention toward the woman who had just redefined the hierarchy without raising her voice, and yet for Richard the sound blurred into something distant, replaced by a different kind of clarity, the kind that comes when the past refuses to stay buried. Months earlier, in an office that overlooked the same skyline now glowing beyond the ballroom windows, he had made a decision with the same calm precision he applied to every business move, a decision documented in contracts, sealed in signatures, justified by logic that felt unshakable at the time, because in his world relationships were measured in value, in alignment, in what they contributed to the structure he was building, and anything that no longer fit could be removed without hesitation. Amara had stood across from him that day, not pleading, not raising her voice, simply listening as he outlined the terms that would strip her from the life they had once shared, the penthouse, the accounts, the access to the network that had always been his domain, and he remembered expecting resistance, expecting emotion, something that would confirm his belief that she needed what he was taking, but she had given him none of that. Only a quiet stillness that he had misread as acceptance, or perhaps as weakness, because it was easier to believe that than to consider the possibility that she was already stepping beyond the reach of everything he controlled. He had signed first, his pen moving with the same confidence that had built his empire, and when he looked up she had met his gaze without hesitation, her expression unreadable, not cold, not broken, simply resolved in a way he had not taken the time to understand, and when she spoke it had not been a negotiation, not a protest, just a single sentence delivered with a calm that now echoed back to him with unsettling precision. "You can keep everything that belongs to you." And at the time he had taken that as confirmation that he was right, that everything worth keeping had always been his. Now, standing in a room where her name carried more weight than his presence, that memory shifted, the meaning rearranging itself into something far less comfortable, because what she had left with had never been listed in any contract, never been something he could quantify or secure. And what she had built since then had not required his approval, his resources, or his permission. Across the ballroom, Amara moved through a circle of executives who now leaned toward her with a kind of attention they once would have reserved for him, her responses measured, her posture unchanged, not seeking to dominate the space but naturally reshaping it around her, and Richard felt something unfamiliar settle into his chest, not panic, not yet, but the early recognition of loss. The kind that does not announce itself loudly but reveals itself in contrast, in the undeniable difference between what once was and what now stands before you. He had believed control was something you could maintain indefinitely, something you could protect with enough strategy, enough foresight, enough distance from emotion. But as he watched the woman he had removed from his life become the center of a world he no longer fully commanded, a different truth began to take form, quiet but undeniable, that control is not lost in a single moment. It erodes in the spaces where you assume it will always remain, and by the time you recognize what has changed, the structure you built your certainty on no longer belongs to you. The night carried on with practiced elegance, but beneath the polished surface something had shifted permanently, and Richard Caldwell could feel it in the way conversations no longer paused for him, in the way attention drifted not toward his presence but toward hers, as if the center of gravity in the room had quietly relocated without asking permission. He set his glass down untouched, the decision small but deliberate, because for the first time in years he needed clarity more than composure, and across the ballroom Amara Bennett stood surrounded not by admiration alone but by something far more valuable in his world, credibility, the kind that could not be inherited or negotiated, only earned through a series of choices no one else witnessed. A senior partner from one of the largest investment firms leaned toward her, his voice low but intent, and Richard did not need to hear the words to understand the shift taking place. Alliances forming, opportunities aligning, doors opening in directions he had not anticipated, and what unsettled him most was not that she had access to them, it was that she no longer needed him to reach them. Months ago, when the contracts were finalized and the separation became official, he had expected her absence to simplify everything, to remove distraction, to reinforce the structure he had spent years building, but instead something subtle had begun to unravel, not dramatically, not in ways that made headlines, but in quiet disruptions that accumulated over time. A missed opportunity here, a delayed negotiation there, a partnership that suddenly required more persuasion than it once had, and at first he had attributed it to market fluctuations, to external variables beyond control, because that was the logical explanation, the safe explanation, the one that did not require him to examine the possibility that something essential had been removed along with her. Now, watching her move through the same world he once believed he owned, he began to recognize the pattern he had overlooked, the way she had always anticipated what others needed before they voiced it, the way she had navigated conversations with a precision that felt effortless, the way her presence had softened edges he did not even realize were sharp, and for the first time he understood that what he had taken for granted had never been a convenience, it had been an advantage he could not replicate. A voice broke through his thoughts, measured, professional, one of his board members stepping closer with a polite smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Richard, we need to discuss the Westbrook deal. There have been complications." And the word lingered longer than it should have, because complications were not supposed to happen under his watch, not at this scale, not with this frequency, and yet here they were, stacking quietly in the background. While his attention remained fixed on the one variable he had failed to calculate, he nodded, maintaining the composure expected of him, but his gaze shifted once more across the room, drawn back to her with a focus that was no longer about curiosity or even recognition, but something deeper, something closer to realization, because the truth was becoming difficult to ignore, that the stability he once credited to his own control had been, in part, the result of her influence, her insight, her ability to see beyond the immediate transaction into the long-term balance he had overlooked. Amara turned slightly as if sensing the shift, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, and for a brief moment their worlds aligned again within the same space, but the difference was unmistakable. She was no longer standing beside him, she was standing independent of him, and that distinction carried a weight he had not anticipated. The room continued to move, conversations rising and falling, deals forming in quiet corners, but for Richard Caldwell the night had taken on a different dimension, one where control was no longer assumed, where outcomes were no longer guaranteed, and where the realization settled in with quiet precision that what he had dismissed as replaceable had, in fact, been irreplaceable all along. Richard did not approach her immediately, because men like him did not chase what they believed would eventually return on its own. But tonight that instinct felt less like confidence and more like hesitation, and hesitation was unfamiliar territory. Instead he stood at the edge of a conversation he barely heard, his attention fixed on the shifting dynamics across the room, watching as Amara moved with the same quiet authority that had once existed behind closed doors, now fully visible, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. A group of executives parted slightly as she stepped away from them, her path unblocked not out of courtesy but out of recognition, and it was in that moment that Richard made his decision, not impulsive, not emotional, but deliberate in the way every move he made had always been, because control, even when uncertain, demanded action. He crossed the distance between them with measured steps, each one carrying the weight of a past he had never needed to revisit until now, and when he finally stopped in front of her, the contrast between who they had been and who they had become stood quietly between them, unspoken but unmistakable. "Amara," he said, her name steady on his tongue, familiar yet somehow altered by time and distance, and she turned to face him fully, not surprised, not unsettled, simply present, her gaze meeting his with the same calm composure she had carried throughout the evening. For a brief moment neither of them spoke, the silence not awkward but precise, as if both understood that whatever was said next would not be casual, would not be meaningless, and Richard, for perhaps the first time in a long time, chose his words with something closer to care than calculation. "You have done well," he continued, the statement simple, almost understated, but beneath it lay an acknowledgement he would not have offered months ago. And Amara held his gaze without reacting, without softening, without offering him the validation he might once have expected. "I have done what needed to be done," she replied, her voice even, measured, carrying no trace of resentment, but no invitation either, and the distinction settled between them like a line that could not be crossed without consequence. Richard inclined his head slightly, absorbing the response, adjusting, recalibrating, because this was no longer a conversation he could control through familiarity. And he shifted to what he understood best, purpose. "There is a situation developing with Westbrook Holdings," he said, his tone returning to the language of business where certainty felt more accessible. "I have been informed that your firm is now in a position to influence the outcome," and the words were careful, structured, an opening framed as information rather than request, because asking had never been part of his approach. Amara listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in her posture, not defensive, not dismissive, simply attentive in a way that made it clear she was evaluating not just the words, but the intention behind them. "And you would like my involvement," she stated, not as a question, but as a clarification, and Richard allowed a brief pause before answering, recognizing that this moment required something different, something he was not accustomed to offering. "I believe it would be mutually beneficial," he said, the phrase familiar, controlled, but lacking the quiet certainty it once carried. Because for the first time the outcome did not belong entirely to him. Amara regarded him for a moment longer, her silence extending just enough to shift the balance of the exchange, to make it clear that time, in this conversation, moved according to her pace, not his, and when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, composed, but edged with a clarity that left no room for interpretation. "There was a time when everything between us was defined by what was beneficial to you." And she let the statement settle, not as accusation, but as fact, before continuing. "I no longer build my decisions around that framework," and in that moment, standing in a room filled with power, wealth, and influence, Richard Caldwell understood something with a precision that cut deeper than any negotiation he had ever lost, that the terms had changed, and for the first time, he was no longer the one defining them. Richard did not respond immediately, because for the first time the space between words mattered more than the words themselves, and in that silence something unfamiliar began to take shape, not anger, not resistance, but the slow recognition that the leverage he once relied on no longer existed in this exchange. He studied her carefully, not as a former husband, not as a man trying to reclaim something personal, but as an investor would assess a force that had the potential to alter outcomes. And what unsettled him most was not her refusal, it was the certainty behind it. The absence of hesitation that made it clear she was not negotiating from emotion but from alignment with something far more stable than circumstance. "You are in a position to change the trajectory of that deal," he said finally, his tone measured, recalibrated, stripped of the assumption that agreement would follow. "And I am offering you a direct partnership," and there it was, not a request, but a structured proposal, familiar territory he hoped might restore balance, because in business there were always terms, always variables that could be adjusted until both sides reached a point of advantage. Amara listened without interruption, her posture unchanged, but there was a subtle stillness in her that carried more weight than movement, the kind that signaled not indecision but clarity already reached before the conversation began. "You are still speaking as if influence is something I am looking to gain," she replied, her voice calm, controlled, each word placed with intention, "but influence is not what I lost," and the statement lingered, not as defiance, but as correction, shifting the entire foundation of the discussion in a way that could not be redirected through strategy alone. Richard felt the shift, the conversation moving beyond the structures he understood, and for a brief moment he considered pressing further, introducing new variables, reframing the opportunity in terms that might appeal to logic, but something held him back, something quieter, something closer to the realization that this was no longer a matter of persuasion. It was a matter of perspective he had not taken the time to understand. Around them, the room continued its steady rhythm, conversations rising and falling, deals being outlined in low voices, but there was a subtle awareness forming, a quiet attention directed toward the exchange taking place between them, because even in a room accustomed to power, there was something rare about witnessing a shift in control that did not rely on volume or force. Amara glanced briefly toward the skyline beyond the windows, the city stretching out in layers of light and motion, a reminder of the scale of the world beyond this room, beyond this conversation, and when she returned her gaze to him there was a softness there, not of emotion, but of certainty, the kind that does not need to defend itself. There was a moment, she said, her voice steady, when I believed everything I needed was inside the life we built together. And she paused, not for effect, but because the truth deserved its own space, and when that was taken away, I thought I had lost more than I could recover, and Richard listened, not interrupting, not redirecting, because something in her tone made it clear this was not a recounting of the past, it was a definition of the present. But what I found, she continued, was that what mattered was never tied to what you could give or take, and the simplicity of the statement carried a weight that no contract could replicate, because it removed him entirely from the equation he had once believed he controlled. Richard exhaled slowly, the realization settling in with a precision that left no room for reinterpretation, because this was not about the deal, not about Westbrook, not even about the past in the way he had framed it. This was about a shift he could not reverse, a version of her that existed completely outside the boundaries he had once defined. Then what would make you consider it? He asked, the question quieter now, stripped of assumption, not a demand, not even a negotiation, but something closer to genuine inquiry, and for the first time since he had approached her, the answer was not something he could anticipate. Amara regarded him for a moment, her expression unchanged, but there was a finality in her gaze that made the outcome clear before she spoke. Nothing that belongs to the past can shape my decisions anymore, she said, and in that moment, with the city stretching endlessly beyond the glass and the weight of the room pressing in from all sides, Richard Caldwell understood that the control he had once exercised so effortlessly was not something he had lost in a single decision, it was something he had given up piece by piece, until there was nothing left to reclaim. The silence that followed her answer did not feel empty, it felt resolved, as if something long unsettled had finally found its place, and for the first time that evening Richard Caldwell did not attempt to fill it, did not reach for another angle or a sharper argument, because there was nothing left in the structure he understood that could shift what had already been decided. Around them, the movement of the room continued with its usual precision, glasses lifted, deals whispered, alliances quietly formed beneath the glow of curated light, but the center of Richard's attention no longer belonged to the room. It remained fixed on the woman standing before him, not because he needed something from her anymore, but because he was beginning to understand what he had never taken the time to see. Amara did not step back, did not create distance, but she did not move closer either, her presence steady, self-contained, as if the space she occupied existed entirely on her own terms, and that realization carried more weight than any rejection, because it meant she was no longer positioned within his world at all. You built something remarkable, Richard said after a moment, his voice quieter now, not calculated, not strategic, simply stated, and the acknowledgement lingered between them without expectation, because for once he was not offering it as leverage, but as recognition. Amara held his gaze, her expression unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in her eyes, not softening, not reopening, simply acknowledging that the words had been heard, and that was enough. I built what I needed, she replied, her tone even, grounded, and the distinction was clear. She had not built it to prove anything to him, or to anyone else, she had built it because it aligned with who she had become. A quiet understanding settled into Richard then, something that did not arrive with force but with clarity, the kind that cannot be undone once it is seen, that the version of success he had always pursued had been defined by accumulation, by control, by the ability to secure outcomes in his favor, but what stood in front of him now was something entirely different, something that did not rely on taking, but on becoming, and for the first time he recognized the limitation in everything he had believed to be strength. Across the room, a familiar voice called his name, one of his senior advisors signaling with urgency that did not belong to the rhythm of the evening, and Richard glanced briefly in that direction, the tension in the man's posture enough to indicate that whatever awaited him would not be resolved with ease. Another complication, another shift in a structure that no longer felt as stable as it once had. When he turned back, Amara had already begun to step away, not abruptly, not dismissively, simply continuing forward with the same quiet certainty that had defined her presence from the moment she entered the room. And for a brief second he considered stopping her, saying something more, something that might alter the trajectory of the moment, but the instinct faded as quickly as it arrived, because he understood now that there was nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to reclaim. Amara, he said once more, not to call her back, but to mark the moment, and she paused, turning just enough to acknowledge him without breaking her path. And in that final exchange there was no unfinished tension, no lingering question, only a clarity that did not require resolution. "You were never something I could replace," he said, the admission simple, unguarded, and for the first time entirely free of calculation. And Amara regarded him for a moment, not with triumph, not with satisfaction, but with the same composed understanding she had carried all along, because she had already moved beyond the need for those words. "No," she replied softly, not as correction, but as completion. "I was never something you could define." And with that, she turned fully, continuing forward into a future that no longer intersected with his, leaving Richard Caldwell standing in a room that still bore his influence, still responded to his presence, but no longer revolved around him. And as the city light stretched endlessly beyond the glass, reflecting a world in constant motion, he understood with a quiet certainty that what he had lost was not just a person, but the part of his life that had once held everything else in balance, and without it, even power felt incomplete. Richard remained still long after she disappeared into the shifting current of the room, his gaze lingering on the space she had occupied as if something of her presence still remained there, something intangible yet undeniable. And for the first time in years he did not move with urgency, did not redirect his focus toward the next deal or the next opportunity waiting to be secured, because something far more consequential had already unfolded, something that could not be reversed with strategy or influence. The advisor who had called his name earlier approached again, this time closer, his voice lower, edged with concern that no longer attempted to hide behind professionalism. "We have a serious issue with Westbrook," he said, each word measured but weighted. "They are shifting their position, and from what we are hearing, they are aligning with Bennett Capital." And the name landed with a quiet finality that required no further explanation, because the implications were immediate, precise, and irreversible. Richard's expression did not change, but something within him settled into place, not shock, not even resistance, but recognition, because this was not coincidence, not timing, not an unexpected turn of events. This was consequence, unfolding with the same quiet precision that had defined every step of her rise. He nodded once, acknowledging the information without reaction, and dismissed the advisor with a brief motion, because there was nothing to discuss in that moment that could alter what had already been set in motion. Across the ballroom, Amara stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city stretching endlessly behind her in layers of light and movement, and there was something almost symbolic in the way she faced outward rather than inward, as if her attention belonged not to the room that had once defined her absence, but to the world she had built beyond it. A group of investors approached her again, their posture respectful, their tone measured, but their interest unmistakable, and as she spoke with them her gestures remained minimal, her voice calm, never raised, never rushed, yet every person within that small circle leaned in slightly, as if aware that what she offered was not simply opportunity, but direction. Richard watched from a distance now, not as a man assessing competition, but as someone witnessing the completion of a process he had set in motion without understanding its outcome, because the reality before him was no longer theoretical, it was structural, embedded in decisions already made, alliances already formed, and a future already moving forward without his control. He turned slightly, his gaze moving briefly across the room that still responded to him, still recognized his presence, still deferred in ways that had once been enough, but the difference was unmistakable. Because influence that depends on presence fades when presence is no longer central, and tonight, for the first time, he was no longer the defining force within the space he had helped shape. The music shifted, softer now, more subdued, and the room adjusted with it, conversations lowering, movements slowing. But Richard remained apart from it, his thoughts no longer aligned with the rhythm of the evening, because something far more definitive had already been decided beyond the reach of this moment. Amara stepped away from the group at the window, her path leading toward the exit with the same quiet certainty that had defined her every movement, not seeking attention, not avoiding it, simply continuing forward without hesitation. and as she passed through the final threshold of the ballroom, the light catching briefly against the fabric of her dress before she disappeared from view, the absence she left behind did not feel like departure, it felt like completion. Richard exhaled slowly, the realization settling fully now, not as regret in the way he had once understood it, but as something deeper, something that could not be corrected or negotiated away, because what had been lost was not an asset, not a partnership, not even a relationship in the traditional sense, it was the alignment that had once held everything else in place, and without it, even the structures he had built with such precision now felt subtly, irreversibly unbalanced, and for the first time, standing in a room that still carried his name, Richard Caldwell understood that power, without the right foundation, does not disappear all at once, it simply stops being enough. The ballroom eventually returned to its familiar rhythm, the kind that allowed people to pretend nothing meaningful had shifted, that everything remained exactly as it had been before, but for Richard Caldwell the illusion no longer held, because once a truth reveals itself, it does not fade back into comfort, it remains, steady and unyielding, reshaping everything that comes after. He stood near the edge of the room now, no longer at its center, his presence still acknowledged, still respected, but no longer defining the direction of attention, and for the first time he did not attempt to reclaim it, because he understood that influence, once altered at its core, cannot be restored through force or familiarity. The skyline beyond the glass stretched endlessly, a reminder of the scale of the world he had once believed he controlled, each light representing a decision, a path, a possibility, and yet none of it felt as certain as it once had, because certainty, he realized, had never been rooted in what he owned, but in something far less tangible that he had failed to recognize until it was gone. The following weeks unfolded with the quiet precision of consequence, not dramatic, not sudden, but consistent in a way that left no room for denial. The Westbrook deal shifting fully beyond his reach, partnerships recalibrating in directions that no longer favored his position, and while his empire did not collapse, it changed, subtly at first, then more noticeably, like a structure adjusting to the absence of a foundational support it had once relied on without question. He adapted, as he always had, making calculated moves, restructuring strategies, reinforcing what remained, but beneath it all there was an awareness that could not be dismissed, that something essential was missing, not in the numbers, not in the contracts, but in the balance that had once allowed everything to function with seamless precision. Across the city, in spaces that no longer intersected with his, Amara Bennett continued forward with the same quiet certainty that had defined her return, her firm expanding not through aggressive acquisition but through deliberate alignment, choosing partnerships that reflected not just opportunity but intention, and in doing so she built something that did not depend on dominance, but on clarity, a structure that held because it was grounded in purpose rather than control. Their paths did not cross again, not in boardrooms, not in public events, not even by chance, and that absence was not marked by tension or unresolved questions. It was simply the natural result of two lives that no longer operated within the same framework. Months later, standing alone in his office overlooking the same city that had once mirrored his certainty, Richard paused, his reflection faint against the glass, and for a moment he allowed himself to see the truth without resistance, without justification, without the instinct to reframe it into something more manageable, because the reality was simple, undeniable, and complete, that what he had taken, what he had claimed, what he had believed defined his power, had never been the source of it at all. He had measured value in assets, in influence, in control, but the one thing that had elevated everything else, the one thing that had brought balance to the structure he built, had never been something he could own, and in losing it, he had not just altered his life, he had revealed its limitations. The city lights flickered against the glass as he exhaled slowly, not in defeat, not in regret as he once understood it, but in recognition, because some lessons do not arrive to be corrected, they arrive to be understood, and in that quiet moment, with nothing left to negotiate and nothing left to reclaim, Richard Caldwell finally grasped the truth that had followed him from the moment she walked away, that the greatest loss is not what you can see disappear, it is what you never realized was holding everything together until it was no longer there.